Cette année-là, il y a eu un grand changement. Parce qu'on n'a jamais vu ça, 90 jours de soleil.
Oui.
Donc vraiment, on a trop ressenti ça. On avait même peur. Est-ce la fin du monde? On ne connaît pas. Au moment où on plantait le soleil, c'était le soleil seulement. La pluie est venue au dernier moment.
Tout le monde a des grands-parents me dit, la pluie par contre tombée dans le mois de juin, juillet. Alors, constat que je fais moi-même, moi, 2 mois ça, yo bay en pile la pluie, surtout des rivières qui descendent. À force, qui fait ravage, qui a la bête, qui a avec raser jardin, tout ça. Alors, moi, ouais, tout, yo qu'on dit, et la pluie plus tombée dans le mois de mai. Mais ça passe tellement by la pluie pour moi-même, d'après ça me constaté. Bon, c'est plus 2 mois ça, au mois de juin et juillet qui baille plus la pluie. Alors, ça vient comme calendrier, saison a changé. Ça vient et cultivateurs pas planifié bien, nous capable de régler activité agricole.
Los inviernos hoy en día entran, por decirlo, más tarde de lo normal y en muchos casos el tiempo es corto, no se va antes. Aparte de eso, tenemos el cambio de la temperatura en fría. Estos meses normalmente ya suele hacer calor, donde la producción de cacao ya empieza a tener una mayor producción, pero debido al frío se está perdiendo gran cantidad de esta producción.
Ici a insu no sɛdeɛ ahyɛaseɛ nsuo piti bosome mmiɛnsɛm na nka nsuo hyɛaseɛ na ɛtɔ ne brana no sisi a ntumi nyɛ saa bio ntumi nyɛ saa nti nsuo no tɔ no wɔ fam sen awia no tumi bɔ sen nsuo no nti ɛma awia no ɛbɔ no ɛma ɛfɛkte yɛ kokoo no paa.
Verano es muy prolongado, entonces hay que regar con más frecuencia. La fuente de riego, la quebrada, se merma porque no le está lloviendo en la montaña, entonces se merma, entonces hay que regar un poquito por el riego y hay que regar con más frecuencia.
As mudanças, elas estão aí. A gente precisa pensar em como mitigar os efeitos dessas mudanças na cultura do cacau. Toda a nossa área de cultivo com o cacau, ele é em sistemas agroflorestais. E esses sistemas, eles privilegiam as essências florestais nativas.
Eniano ɛboa ma ɛbɔ me kokoo no ho ban ebi ne sɛ ɛma nwunu ba afuo no so na afei nso kokoo a esi dua no ase ankasa na ɛyɛ ana ɛntaa hu sɛ deɛ baabi a dua nsi no.
Tenemos árboles de sombra, frutales, maderables, los tenemos porque el ecosistema donde vivimos existe una gran cantidad de insectos, animales pequeños, donde habitan en estos árboles. Si nosotros le quitamos todo este medio donde ellos puedan vivir o desarrollarse, probablemente estos insectos se convierten en una plaga para nuestra finca. O sea, necesitamos una interrelación de la naturaleza.
Bon, ces arbres-là, ça protège les petits plants. Les petits plants de cacao.
Pour ne pas que ces plants-là meurent.
Pour ne pas que ces plants-là meurent. Et ça donne aussi la pluie.
Primero, que nos da vida dentro de un cultivo. Segundo, que si es un árbol frutal, pues tenemos la presencia de insectos, especialmente avispas, de pronto que son benéficas.
Entonces, ese cambio climático nos ha afectado mucho y pues estamos trabajando, digamos que siempre hemos tratado de evitar las quemas y evitar ese tipo de prácticas nocivas porque vemos que estamos siendo afectados directamente por el cambio climático. Estos calores muy intensos, entonces nos generan dificultades en la producción de cacao. Este cultivo está integrado con árboles nativos, digamos que se seleccionaron árboles nativos de acá, se dejaron. Algunos son especies maderables, otras son especies más para conservar agua y para generar de pronto el reciclaje de nutrientes, como es el caso del más llamado nacedero o matarratón, que lo utilizamos para fijar de pronto nutrientes al suelo y también nos proporcionan un sombrío adecuado para el cultivo. Entonces está integrado con ese tipo de árboles maderables y otros que son de pronto para utilizarlos como sombrío y también como recicladores de nutrientes.
Hello, and thank you. I first start by thanking all the cocoa farmers in this video who shared their testimony. It's really important to hear their voices. I am Alex Ferguson, WCF's Vice President for Communications and Membership, and welcome you to our session on nature-based solutions for climate action. Before we get started, I will quickly remind you of some housekeeping points. First, we want all attendees to have access to our full Zoom functionalities. So I'd like to remind everyone to click on Use the Zoom app below the video here. The sentence reads, if you're experiencing audio issues, use the Zoom app instead. If at any point during the partnership meeting you encounter any technical challenges, you have access to technical support through the partnership meeting platform. Now that we are all in the Zoom window, I'd like to give a reminder that you will find the interpretation button to access French and Spanish translation on the bottom right under this screen. Also a reminder that this is an interactive session. You can ask questions by clicking on the chat bubble and submitting to all panelists. I will make every effort to include these audience questions if there is time in the next session. So let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce Minister Goldsmith, the United Kingdom's Minister for Pacific and the Environment. Minister Goldsmith will give an address on nature-based solutions for climate action and then answer questions. Over to you, Minister Goldsmith.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex, and thanks for the intro. So it's a real pleasure, first of all, to be speaking to you today how a sustainable future for the sector, for the cocoa sector, can be a part of the solutions that we desperately need to some of the biggest problems that we now face. Cocoa is an equatorial hit gone global. For centuries, there's not, to my knowledge, been a single market that hasn't taken to it. And now the chocolate market is worth around $130 billion, with consumption going up continuously. But there is nevertheless much that needs to change, and it needs to change urgently, because we know that we can't expect to destroy the world's wet tropical forest at a rate of around 30 football pitches every single minute without at some point paying a terrible price. But just in case we have become immune to these terrible statistics, and we all do, we hear them so often, I want to put it another way. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. If we scale that back to a single year, humans have been around for less than 1 hour. Our industrial revolution began much less than 1 minute ago, and in under 1 second, we've destroyed more than half the world's tropical forest. Now, it goes without saying that another second like that, and it's game over. Not just for the 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity that lives in forests, or the billion or so people who depend directly on forests, but all of us. We all depend profoundly on forests for air to breathe, food, resources, medicines, trade, functioning climate and water systems. And to make matters worse, deforestation and land use change more broadly has become the second biggest contributor to climate change. We know that around 80% of global tropical deforestation is driven by agriculture, in particular to produce those globally traded commodities that we all depend on, like cocoa. And in just over 2 decades, West Africa alone has lost 2.3 million hectares of forest to cocoa cultivation, causing soil degradation, water insecurity, and crop failures. And it's often argued that this level of destruction is a necessary, unavoidable part of the journey towards prosperity. But we know that it is the world's poorest who suffer first and worst when those free but hopelessly undervalued services that nature provides begin to fail, like the millions of people who depend on continued cocoa production in West Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in the Americas. They're on the front line. Globally, more than half of the land we use is now degraded, and it's estimated that the diminishing yields resulting from that will hit around 500 million small farms the hardest. And in a vicious cycle, the task of growing food for a fast-growing population is made more complicated and unpredictable by the climate change that it is contributing to. So reconciling food production and nature is essential. Simply, we cannot hope to provide sufficient food for a growing population unless we learn to do so in a way that supports and works with nature. And we cannot hope to protect natural ecosystems without radically reforming land use. In recent years, we've seen extraordinary clean technology revolution. The market is transitioning far faster, I think, than anyone predicted. Zero-emission vehicles are right on the cusp of going mainstream. Investments in renewables now exceeds investments in new fossil fuels. Coal use in the States fell faster under President Trump than it did under President Obama, despite the politics. But the trajectory for nature continues very much in the wrong direction. We know that there is no pathway to net zero emissions, reversing biodiversity loss, or alleviating poverty that does not involve protecting and restoring nature on an unprecedented scale. Nature-based solutions, like protecting and restoring forests and peatlands, mangroves, and so on, could provide around a third of the most cost-effective climate change solution we need, while also helping nature recover. In addition, actually, to making communities better prepared to cope with the inevitable rise of climate change. But despite that colossal potential contribution, nature-based solutions attract a mere 3% of global climate finance, and that makes no sense at all. So as presidents of the next UN climate conference in Glasgow, we are wanting to change the rules dramatically. We're doubling our international climate finance. We've committed to spending a significant chunk of that uplift on nature, and we're encouraging other countries to do the same. But even if we succeed in persuading other donor countries to put nature at the heart of their climate responses, even if we manage to increase public finance for nature-based solutions, we know the task is far too big for public money alone. So we need to address the core drivers of ecological degradation as well. And we need to change the incentives that are currently stacked against forests by a factor of around 40 to 1. The OECD, for instance, tells us that the top 51 food-producing countries provide around $700 billion a year, every year, in public support or subsidies for agricultural producers. The vast majority of that incentive is driving harmful practices. And coincidentally, we're told by scientists that we need to mobilize around $700 billion a year to reverse environmental destruction and to put nature globally on a path to recovery. So changing the way governments incentivize land use is a prerequisite not only to reversing nature loss, but to tackling climate change and feeding a growing human population as well. In the UK, we are already in the process of introducing a new environmental land management scheme, a new subsidy scheme that will shift public support away from harmful land use practices to reward farmers instead for delivering on environmental benefits. And as part of our COP26 campaign, we're determined to build a coalition of countries committed to doing similarly. And if we succeed, the benefits are huge. We believe a global shift towards sustainable agriculture and land use could add $2.3 trillion in productive growth to the global economy and create around 200 million jobs by 2050, as well as helping our climate, nature, and communities recover. As COP presidents, we're also asking other countries, north, south, east, west, developed, developing, rich, poor, producer, consumer, to come together in an alliance of ambitious countries committed to cleaning up global supply chains. We know that half of the commodity-driven deforestation that's happening in the world is illegal. In some areas, that figure is closer to 90%. So in the UK, we've announced a new law just last week that will require bigger businesses operating in the UK to remove illegal deforestation from their supply chains. And we know from countless examples on the ground that what is needed is possible. There is plenty of good work that's going on, like the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which the World Cocoa Foundation has played a key role in establishing, launched in London with the support of the Prince of Wales just 3 years ago. It's an ambitious public-private partnership between the cocoa and chocolate industries and the Ivorian and Ghanaian governments. We're supporting this work through the UK's £120 million investment in partnerships for forests, making cocoa production part of protecting tropical forests on a landscape scale. In Ghana, alongside Tutong, we're working with the Bia and Huabesco, please forgive me for the pronunciations, districts, primary forests, home to 160 species of birds, 62 mammal species, including forest elephants and leopards, as well as some of West Africa's tallest trees. We're providing farm level support to over 23,000 farmers, incentivizing approaches that protect trees, provide shade, and promote regrowth. And income from honey and animal rearing is keeping children in education, minimizing the need for bushmeat, and so also helping to stifle the grim illegal wildlife trade. And these partnerships work. The rate of loss in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana halved from 2018 to 2019 from a high base. But clearly, we are going to have to see those efforts scaled up much more broadly. The market, I think we can all agree, is the single most powerful force for change on Earth, other than perhaps nature herself. But unless and until the market applies value to nature and a cost to its destruction, that power, that extraordinary power, is going to continue to fuel economic, ecological, humanitarian disaster. So we need to address those market failures. And I think that is perhaps the biggest challenge that we face. But facing it is no longer a choice, it really is now a duty. And there's no doubt that cocoa has a hugely important role to play in that process. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussions that follow.
Thank you, Minister Goldsmith, for that address and those really insightful comments. And let's get straight to some questions from me. Audience members should also feel free to ask their own. As I said earlier, you can enter them into the chat box, and I'll make every effort to get to them if there is time. So, Minister Goldsmith, just going back to some of the points you raised, looking forward to COP26, what do you want to achieve for the world's forests? What do you want to be able to say afterwards that was achieved at this event at the end of 2021?
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, on a general level, we need to massively raise global political ambition. I mean, the outcome we want is that our forests are better protected and that degraded land is restored on an unprecedented scale. We know that needs to happen. And that requires much greater political ambition. Just a few weeks ago, 76 countries has signed up to the Leaders Pledge for Nature at the UN General Assembly. And I don't know how many of the listeners today or participants have read the pledge, but it is genuinely a very ambitious and radical statement. I think it is the most ambitious such statement that certainly that I've ever come across. And we played a big role in strengthening it. The job now is to turn those very, very powerful words into action. And that's what the UK is committed to doing. And in the next year, we are co-presidents of COP, but we're also president of G7. So we have a great opportunity to change the debate. And if there are three basic things that we need to deliver, it's never as simple as this, but I'm going to make it simple. The first is finance. We want more finance for nature. We need more public finance. I mean, donor countries need to prioritize nature and knock that 3% much higher up. And we need private finance. And the private finance could come if we get to the point of having globally trusted high integrity carbon markets and tackling some of the thorny issues around Article 6 in the run up to COP. If we get that right, that will see billions of pounds flowing into nature. The second issue is targets. Targets matter, and we're pushing very hard for the strongest possible targets at the CBD, the Biodiversity Conference being hosted in China. One of the things that we've been calling for is 30 by 30, which is protection of 30% of the world's ocean and 30% of the world's land by 2030. We need other targets and mechanisms for holding countries to account in delivering those targets. And the third area is tackling the drivers. Now, I'm not going to repeat what I said in my opening remarks, but those drivers need to, there's no point pouring money from aid budgets into nature if we're going to continue to drive destruction through much bigger sums of money, those land use subsidies or our supply chains. So dealing with those drivers is a prerequisite. And the very last thing I'd say is, from the UK's point of view, we're wanting to build really ambitious partnerships in order to move the dial in a meaningful way in some of the key regions, Southeast Asia, Congo Basin, Amazon, and beyond. There is scope there for some really big interventions, working with those countries to ensure that it becomes more worthwhile keeping forests alive as opposed to knocking them down. I'm sorry that was such a long-winded answer. Big question there.
Yeah, I've got another big question, which is sort of zeroing in on a component of what you've laid out. In today's Financial Times, United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote that at, quote, next year's COP26 summit, we will urge countries and companies around the world to join us in delivering net zero globally. What do you see as the role for food companies, and particularly as we're in the cocoa sector, cocoa and chocolate companies, in getting us to delivering net zero globally?
Yeah, it's a crucial question, actually, because we know that the majority of deforestation is caused by commodity production. We know that has to stop. I mean, you don't need to be a scientist, a mathematician to recognize that these things can't last forever. So reconciling agriculture with nature is just top of the list in terms of priorities. And of course, the big food companies play a massively important role in that. And what they can do, and I think they're in a privileged position in the sense that they, many of these food companies deal directly with consumers. They know what consumers want. They will know that consumers increasingly, just like voters, often the same people, increasingly want to see leadership. They want to see genuine action to address these issues. So they know that's where the market is. They know where the demand is, and they're in a position to translate or convey that message to the countries in which they're working, with a view to cleaning up their supply chains. And we know from companies that are engaging in best practice that it is possible to break that link between production and destruction. We know that's possible. We know that companies can flourish in doing so, but we need each and every country to figure out how to lighten their ecological footprint and to strive to become best practice. And what we're trying to do in the UK is to sort of create a minimum bar through the new due diligence laws that I mentioned in my introductory remarks. But ideally, companies will engage in a frantic competition to go far beyond what we're asking of them with this due diligence legislation, because collectively they have the power to turn the tide.
Yeah, those are key points, and some of the issues raised about the planned UK due diligence legislation, I think you're aware of. There are concerns that it only holds companies to account for local laws, which may be weak or ill-enforced, and there's also calls from fair trade and others, and this is a point that one of our audience members, Neil Barston, has raised about fair trade, asking that the Environment Bill also include globally recognized due diligence to protect farmers. So I think a question being raised is, how robust will the UK due diligence legislation be, do you think?
Yeah, and it is a completely legitimate question, and one that we have addressed many times internally in government, trying to figure out what the best route is. First thing I want to say is this is not a ban on all commodities. We clearly, that's not a good thing. I mean, people often talk about banning palm oil, for example, but if we did, it would be disastrous because it is such an efficient crop, and you displace that with other forms, which would end up taking 3 or 4 times more land. It's designed to ensure that the products that we do use have been produced according to laws in the countries where they're produced, and that leaves a gap, no doubt, for the legal deforestation that's happening. But it is worth bearing in mind that around 50% of all tropical deforestation is currently illegal. And in some areas, in some parts of Brazil, for instance, it's closer to 90%. So if we were able to address that problem, that would be stupendously good news, given where the trends are going at the moment. We're not pretending this legislation will solve the problem of deforestation. But if we can deal with that part of it, we're dealing with the majority of it, and it would be a massive result. But the second one is a strategic answer, and that is that we could peg this due diligence to a high global standard. And on many levels, that would be a great thing to do. But the effect of doing so would mean that we'd be working on our own. And we are a big market in the UK, but we're not a giant market. We aren't big enough to flip the global market. And if we want to make this thing work, we need to build a global coalition. We need countries like China on board, a coalition of countries committed to working together to ensure that commodities are not grown on illegally deforested land. If we can do that, and if we can build a big coalition, we can flip the market in a very, very significant way. So I think that is a better outcome than the UK doing it on its own, pegging it to a higher standard, sending a very big signal, no doubt, but not moving the market in the way that we would if we built a coalition. So I think we're in the right place on this, and I think it'll have a big impact. But not to say it comes without risks. Of course it doesn't. All legislation does. But if we're right about this, it'll have a massive impact.
And do you see the potential for building these global coalitions around this type of legislation and these moves? Do you see that as a viable as something that can be achieved in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I have no doubt at all that we can. So, if we look at the producer countries, for example, we know, I mentioned earlier, and you will be talking no doubt today a fair bit about Ghana, Ivory Coast in relation to cocoa. We know that Indonesia, the first country to really go through all the flag tea hoops and form a voluntary partnership agreement with the EU on the basis of sustainable and legal timber production. There is a willingness among those producer countries to engage, and that is a very good thing. We're talking regularly, for example, to my counterparts in Indonesia. Among companies, there is no doubt that many food companies are wanting to go further than anything we're proposing in our legislation. Without a doubt, there's a demand there, and I think that's a reaction to consumer demand. And in terms of consumer countries, what we've done is a world first, and I'm very proud that the UK is doing that. But it's not going to be a world last. We know from my discussions, and I'm sure the same is true of other ministerial colleagues with other countries, other consumer countries, that they are wanting to do something very similar. So I have no doubt we will build a coalition. I don't know how big that coalition is going to be. I hope it reaches a critical mass. And the last thing I'd say is that we're hearing some fascinating things from China. The head of the biggest importer of soya, for example, we gave a speech recently in which he talked about the need to clean up supply chains, remove deforestation from supply chains. Well, China is the biggest importer by far. And so if China were to work with us, which I very much hope they will, on this issue and do something similar, again, the ripple effect would be gigantic. The market signal sent to producer countries would be huge, and it would give consumer countries an opportunity to get a step up, to effectively kind of maximize their market share by doing the right thing. So I think all the incentives would be in the right place. And the short answer to your question is yes, I think we can, and I hope right, and it needs to be significant in order to be able to move the market.
Yeah, and just sort of getting some follow-up questions too on the UK due diligence issue. One here from Anthony Fontaine, who's the managing director of the Voice Network, a large NGO who we work with, who asks whether you'd be willing to state that the UK due diligence regulation will be able to follow EU regulation if that would have enough a high enough standard. Was the question.
So I'm not sure practically what that means, because at the moment, I don't think there is EU regulation on this issue, but clearly we want the EU to regulate in a similar way. And I've been talking to counterparts in France and various other countries, and there's a real appetite to do this. I haven't sensed any great resistance. And it would be very helpful if whatever emerges is very similar to what we've produced. Hopefully we will have passed our law very, very soon. So we will have a law in place by the time other countries start doing the same. But clearly cooperation and collaboration is essential. And so my interest would be to ensure that we're as close as possible in terms of the outcome we want. And that will be less confusing for the world. And I think it would send a much purer and cleaner signal. But by the way, that's why we've gone down the legality route, because we know that by going that route, we're going to maximize the opportunity for other countries to get involved. And if we go beyond that, it's very unlikely that we'd collect much support around the world. So I think we have chosen a fairly simple route and one that's replicable, and I would strongly encourage other countries to follow suit, and I'm pretty certain they will.
Thank you. Got a question also from, actually it's from one of my colleagues at WCF, Tim McCoy, which addresses the issue of deforestation and human rights, which is often a difficult one, and it's really the question of protecting forests. Sometimes requires people who have been living in those forests to be relocated at considerable cost and social disruption. Do you see the UK government and other leaders on environmental issues as being willing to contribute financially and technically to supporting affected populations?
So I would question the first part. I think removing people who've been living in forests, if a forest is worth protecting, and it has people in it, that would suggest that the people living in it know what they're doing. And we know that, I believe it's the case, in fact, that 80% of the world's pristine forests are occupied by indigenous people. So the very last thing you'd want to do from an ecological point of view, not to mention ethical point of view, would be removing those people. They're absolutely part of the solution, and I think we can learn from them. So I think that would be very much the wrong approach. But would we be willing to commit resources to working with and helping those people who do sustainably live in forests? Absolutely right. I mean, I mentioned that we're doubling our climate finance. We're putting a big chunk of that on nature-based solutions. Part of that, we're currently exploring how we can improve our resourcing and support for indigenous people around the world. We think they are an integral part of the solution, and quite often their rights over the land that they occupy are murky, and therefore there's a vulnerability that comes with that. And I think that's an area that we can look at with a view to having a real impact. And there are plenty of other issues as well. So yes, I can't put numbers to it, and I can't make absolute commitments, but I can tell you we're looking very closely at this now, and it's something that I'm personally very involved in.
Thank you. Just one final question. You mentioned the Cocoa and Forests Initiative, and what do you see as public? How do you see public-private partnerships as playing a role in what you want to achieve with COP26 and beyond?
I think first of all, I mean, without wanting to sound like I'm stating the obvious, I think they're massively important. No country, no company, no community can do this alone. It absolutely requires partnership. And since we're talking about changing global systems, that requires therefore every part of that system to be part of the solution as opposed to the problem. And I think the Cocoa and Forest Initiative is a really, really good example. Exactly as I'd said, it brings together governments in those producer countries, companies right the way throughout the supply chain, civil society, absolutely critical, donors, a grand collective effort to stop deforestation. And there are, we've seen effects. We've seen the effects in terms of reduced deforestation, improved livelihoods. We've seen that it is possible to reconcile agriculture with nature and with livelihoods. The challenge now, and this will only be delivered through these partnerships that you're describing, is to take those examples of best practice today and roll them into the norm. They need to become the norm. They need to become mainstream throughout the sector. And the UK will do absolutely anything and everything we can to help push that process along.
So thank you very much. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. And this concludes today's session. I want to thank you, Minister, for joining us today, for your valuable insights and for responding to the questions from myself and the audience. Thank you very much and goodbye. So just to tell everybody, this concludes our second session of the 2020 WCF partnership meeting. And we will meet again right now in the next agenda item, which is called Fighting Child Labor in Cocoa, Building Partnerships and Scaling Up Action, which has a stellar group of panelists. So see you in a minute in the next session. Thank you.